There are few ancient civilizations which seem to elicit such fascination as Tartessos, driven, in part, probably, by long-standing ideas connecting it to everything from Atlantis and semi-mythical lands of fabled wealth, to modern nationalism, to sort of proto-Nazi archaeological theories. So what we'll do in this video, and in the ones that follow, is explore this civilization. Now, that being said, what we are primarily dealing with here is archaeology. So here is my plan for this video. Here is a map of the Iberian Peninsula. And here is a map of Tartessian territory. Over here, I'm going to fill up with photos of archaeological sites, artifacts, that sort of thing. So it might be better to treat this as a podcast and just listen to it. That being said, and the reasons for why this is will become clear as both this video and as the video series progresses, don't take the map of Tartessian territory literally. These are not set borders, like, for example, the US-Canadian border, in the sense of a clearly defined demarcation that divides land between two states. This is instead an approximation of Tartessian territory based on Tartessian sites and relevant artifacts, particularly pottery, metalwork, mining villages, and the associated slag and other debris from mining metal. So in this video, I want to broadly do two things as an introduction to Tartessos. I want to explore some of the archaeology, but I also want to explore how Tartessos came to be discovered in the first place. And the story of this discovery begins actually not in Iberia, where we know Tartessos was located, but actually in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean much more broadly. In 1870, Heinrich Schliemann, at the behest of Frank Calvert, began excavations at the site of Hisarlik, which Calvert had tentatively identified as the site of Troy. Schliemann's excavations, if we want to call it that, I mean he did use dynamite after all, uncovered several distinct layers of occupation, and it is now broadly agreed that the site is the location of the Bronze Age city of Troy. If you want to be really technical, there are those who would argue that it's not, on the basis of further digging not having located the archive. The counter-argument here being that Schliemann blew it up and it's actually in the back dirt. But the point is that in the late 19th century, a city from the Bronze Age, several thousand years before the present, was discovered. And it was discovered with the use of ancient texts, notably the Iliad. This is something that happened often throughout the 19th century, but particularly in the late 19th century. Schliemann, for example, went on to excavate several other sites, and in the middle of that century, several adventurers and amateur archaeologists began to excavate Nineveh, and shortly after that, the city of Ur began to be excavated as well. What I'm trying to get at here is that in the 1800s, the young discipline of archaeology began to use texts written thousands of years ago to locate and then excavate cities and other sorts of ruins that were mentioned in those texts. Several of those texts, notably the writings of Herodotus, Pliny, and Avienus, as well as others like Pausanias, mention a wealthy trading city far to the west, past the Pillars of Hercules, which they call Tartessos. And additionally, Aristotle also tells us that Tartessos is the name of a river. This may also be the same location that biblical and Assyrian sources call Tarshish, something that we'll come back to over the course of this video series. So, in the late 19th century, archaeologists began to search for Tartessos using those ancient sources. The argument being, and frankly it made sense, that because these texts were used to find other cities in Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean, then they should be able to use those same sources which mention Tartessos to locate that city. The problem, however, is that no city, despite all the digging, seemed to be turning up. And this was the strange thing about all of it, because it's not like there was no material evidence of Tartessos being excavated, and the texts were therefore just nonsense. One of the enduring debates about Tartessian history revolves around when exactly the Phoenicians began to arrive in Iberia, first as traders and this is really where the debate heats up, where they begin to arrive as colonists, which is where our first archaeologists come into play. So, in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, the study of Tartessian archaeology, or what was to become Tartessian archaeology, was dominated by two men, George Bonser and Adolf Scholten. Bonser was a British archaeologist who excavated, on and off, a lot of different sites in the Iberian Peninsula, most of which were necropoli, associated with the Phoenicians, and on the basis of pottery, many of the sites he excavated date to the 8th and the 7th centuries BC. So we have this presence of Phoenician cemeteries and trading centers in Iberia, and then up in the Rio Tinto mountains, there are tons, like literal tons, of slag from silver mining that had been done around that same period, which we can tell from the presence of pottery in mining camps and villages. The Rio Tinto mountains are situated within what's known as the Pyritic Belt, a stretch of mountains that runs across southwest Portugal and Spain, and which is known for its abundance of copper, iron, tin, gold, and silver. So, because the Assyrians had conquered the Phoenician cities in the 8th century BC, and then imposed tribute payments on those cities, and because this was the period when coinage began to come into increased usage, Bonser's interpretation of what he was looking at here essentially is that the Phoenicians had come to Iberia in search of mineral wealth to pay the tribute and to get the silver that was required for coinage. The texts say that there was a large city known for its vast wealth, but what Bonser primarily found were two things. He found Phoenician sites, and he also found this other set of material remains, which did not quite look Phoenician, but sort of did. So then what could this be? His answer is that those same texts which talk about the wealthy city of Tartessos also discuss a Celtic invasion of Iberia, maybe around the 6th century BC. So he argued that this other set of materials was a blending of the two, something he termed Celto-Punic. So, in other words, he does not appear to have found the fabled city of Tartessos, despite looking in the place where the ancient sources said the city was located, along the river that we know as the Guadalquivir, but which the Greeks, and particularly Aristotle, called Tartessos. Into this picture comes Adolf Scholten. He excavated several Roman-era sites from across Iberia, and then he decided to take a stab at the problem of Tartessos. But Scholten does something a little different here. Bonser had primarily relied on the writings of Strabo and Herodotus, whereas Scholten placed greater faith in another source, a poem written by the 4th century AD Roman Avienus, so over 1,000 years removed from the period when Phoenicians started arriving in Iberia, and when Tartessos seems to be first attested, titled Ora Maritima, or the Sea Coast. This is a work whose subject is cities and coastal locations ranging from the Mediterranean coast of Iberia to the British Isles. Scholten potentially had vast resources at his disposal because the patron of his work was Kaiser Wilhelm II, but Scholten was even less of a professional archaeologist than Bonser was, so eventually the two had to work together. That being said, the two of them did not mix well, largely because of how Scholten viewed the material evidence that they were excavating. Scholten's views of history and archaeological material were colored very heavily by folkish thinking. This was a mystical, almost quasi-religious ethnic nationalist movement that arose in Central Europe during the late 19th century, and central to its conception of history is that rather than, like, war or class conflict, or something like that, history is driven by competition between distinct races. So while Scholten did acknowledge that the Phoenicians appear to have had a direct presence in Iberia, he argued that Tartessos must have had an Indo-European origin, specifically that they were Hellenistic Aryans, and that if there was any sort of influence from the Phoenicians, it was strictly material. For Scholten, the mystical Aryan spirit, which made Tartessos the westernmost outpost of Western civilization, whereas the Greeks were the easternmost outpost, is what allowed this great civilization to spread across Iberia. Now, according to Avienus, who Schulten was relying upon, the city of Tartessos, and thus in Schulten's thinking this Aryan civilization, was located in what is today a nature preserve, the Doñana Marshes. It has a total area of about 210 square miles or 543 square kilometers, and this area corresponds to what Avienus called the Ligustin Lake. Schulten and Bonser thought that this had been filled in by silt deposits over hundreds of years. It later turned out that they were correct, but although they did discover some villages in the Doñana marshes, they tended to date to after the period when the text said that Tartessos should have existed, but still, they're not coming up with any major city. So, in frustration, Schulten then published a book which argued that, actually, the city of Tartessos is to be associated with the Atlantis described by Plato, and if you have ever heard of Tartessos being analogous to that place, this is where the idea originates. It was then thought that perhaps the primary sources were somewhat confused. After all, the archaeologists argued, it would appear that the authors of the surviving sources did not travel to Iberia. Although the search for a city had so far turned up nothing, or at least nothing substantial, there was a significant amount of smaller sites, pottery, and metalwork being discovered, and it's this body of evidence which, until the 1950s, had largely been labeled as Celto-Punic or just Punic, that would create a shift in the search for this lost civilization. Typically, when history and archaeology are put to political uses, we should be cautious about conclusions drawn from it, but ironically, this is a major reason why Tartessos came to be understood as something much more than just a city. In 1958, a hoard was discovered, known as the Treasure of El Carambolo. It's made up of 21 separate items, and although there is still debate over whether or not it's Phoenician or Tartessian, the discovery was a bombshell for Tartessic studies because it was discovered at a time when the Spanish government had a very particular aim in mind with this lost civilization. After the discovery of El Carambolo, the study of Tartessos took off because the Spanish government interpreted Tartessos not as any sort of mystical Aryan civilization or as the result of Phoenician colonization, but as a civilization that was indigenous to Iberia. It was the first Spanish empire, and Tartessos was employed as a unifying feature of Iberian history to try and weld together a country still reeling from a horrific civil war. It was in this context that these materials, which older archaeologists like Bonser had classified as Celto-Punic, began to be re-examined, and enough sites with this stuff had been discovered by the early 1960s that archaeologists began to realize that what they were looking at was not actually Celto-Punic, in part because it was too old. It was, in fact, Tartessian. So now the texts were basically discarded, and the search for an elusive city was more or less abandoned, in favor of what was quickly becoming a huge amount of archaeological data, which, when you remove what the texts state about one city, revealed a huge, culturally unified area with a very distinct chronological period. There is the pre-Phoenician Late Bronze Age, which runs between about 900 and about 750 BC, and then there is the Orientalizing phase, which runs between about 750 and about 550 BC, which plugs this archaeological zone into a Mediterranean world which was heavily interconnected, and which helps explain why materials from the Eastern Mediterranean show up in Iberia. Once this was understood, a broad zone of Tartessic control could be mapped onto southwestern Iberia, which is what you see overlain on the satellite map of the peninsula I'm using for the video. And the goal of archaeologists from about the 1950s to about the 1980s was, instead of searching for a singular city, to understand the multitude of sites and material objects that now fell into the category of Tartessian. The study of Tartessos is primarily archaeological. It essentially has to be. There has, however, since the late 1980s, been a further shift in investigation, and it centers around trying to reconcile textual mentions of a city, as well as the continuing influence of the Phoenicians in Iberia, with what the archaeology has revealed, which is a series of big towns and cemeteries, alongside what are called warrior stelae. Tartessic material culture is now well known and is fairly recognizable, and the lack of a capital is accounted for by these big towns, essentially through the argument that Tartessos was a hierarchical civilization that was also proto-urban. So rather than having a capital, there were a series of powerful elites based at these towns. Some of the most extensive archaeology has been done at the modern city of Huelva, and if there was an inspiration for a singular city that we can call Tartessos, it could very well be beneath Huelva. Up in the mountains around the city, there are a collection of mining villages which have thousands of tons of slag as a result of silver mining, and it seems, at least as of right now, that of all the Tartessic sites we know of, ancient Huelva has the greatest concentration of mining villages near it. In 1998, a series of rescue digs was conducted at Huelva, and it revealed thousands of pottery shards dating between the middle of the 9th and the middle of the 8th centuries BC. In total, approximately 9,000 different shards, which had origins all across the Mediterranean, but particularly, pots were discovered that were originally manufactured in Tyre. Mixed in with all of this pottery were local ceramics and metalwork, indicating that whatever ancient Huelva was, it was clearly a wealthy trading center that was in existence prior to the Phoenicians showing up. There were also lead weights discovered that were used at the time in the eastern Mediterranean, indicating that merchants from Phoenicia were traveling to Huelva during these centuries, probably in search of silver, and as I mentioned at the start of the video, in the 8th century, silver mining took off, and judging by the slag, it seems like it reached almost Roman levels of production. Huelva was becoming bigger and bigger as the 8th century wore on, and the archaeology tells us that circular forms of housing gave way to a grid-patterned city, and the defensive works were expanded at least twice. This happened to such an extent that many would now tentatively identify Huelva with the Tartessos mentioned in ancient sources, although we should note here that the identification is not unanimous. That could very well change in the future, and it's likely that it will, as more work is done. But Tartessos is now known to be firmly historical, and is no longer lost, and I'm excited to start exploring its history here on this channel.